Joining us now is former Secretary of State and Fox News contributor, the great Mike Pompeo. Mr. Secretary, good to see you. Thanks for joining us on The Bottom Line.
Thank you, Sean. It's great to be with you and digging both.
All right, so let's talk about the messaging from the White House. They came out and told us this balloon's no big deal. It's not a threat, Mike. However, now Kamala comes out and goes, oh, no, it was actually used by the Chinese to spy on America over some very sensitive assets that we have in the country. What do you make of this?
Yeah, they had the narrative that they wanted, but not the narrative that has proven to be the truth. Vice President Harris said that this balloon was not helpful. That is as understated as you can possibly get. And to say, boy, we don't want this to change the relationship between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party has a presumption that the Chinese Communist Party isn't, at the very least, at economic war against us. This was a balloon that flew across the country for 5 days. We know that the whole world watched while our sovereignty was being violated. And so there are statements, too, that said, well, this isn't a military threat. Well, fair enough. That's a pretty narrow threat definition. It certainly threatened us over the long run in terms of what the Chinese Communist Party is likely to have learned about our air defenses, our capabilities, likely also the president's response to those kinds of attacks, those kinds of threats. This is certainly something that the Chinese Communist Party is gleeful that they saw for 5 days, American sovereignty violated, and the United States do literally nothing in response.
Secretary, today's Wall Street Journal has this story, breaking story, that there were Trump-era officials who were aware of suspected balloons that were in U.S. airspace. That it says that it goes back to Pentagon analysts reached an assessment in the summer of 2020, but the assessment never got to be assertive. It seems like it was buried within the Pentagon at that time. What do you make of that?
Dig, and I've now had the chance to get a briefing from the administration, so I want to be a little bit careful.
Okay.
But the article that was in the WSGA today was pretty clear. There was some knowledge of something, but make no mistake about it, what transpired 2 weeks ago was fundamentally different than anything that had happened before. And so whether these were small balloons, exactly the penetration they had inside the United States, there's a lot of noise always, certainly in the Department of Defense, certainly at the CIA when I was there. There's lots of things that happen at a low level. It sounds like that's what this was. Folks were trying to figure it out. They chose not to brief this to a senior leader because they weren't very certain about what they knew as well. But for the administration to say, well, it happened before us too, is just silly. This is fundamentally different than anything that's happened before in the United States.
So, Mr. Secretary, you dealt with the Chinese quite a bit as the Secretary of State. How do they read, one, sending the balloon over the country, violating our sovereignty, as you mentioned, but also Joe Biden and Kamala coming out and saying it's not going to affect or change our relationship with them? How do they read this?
Sean, they read it much like Vladimir Putin read Joe Biden when he said that a minor incursion into Ukraine would be okay.
Right.
Right. This kind of weakness is deeply provocative. They view it as a green light. To use the old Southwest Airlines phrase, they feel free to move about the cabin. And that's risky for the American people. So these balloons, just one thread in the garment. Think about what they're doing in our schools. Think about the land that they're buying here in the United States. Think about this virus they foisted on our country as well. This is a pattern in practice. And when Xi Jinping sees that he can do this to the United States, Sean, I promise you he is viewing further aggression as more likely to take place and more likely to be productive than he did before the balloon transited our country.
Right. It's astonishing. Competition, not conflict with China. Mr. Secretary, listen to this to John Kirby today about one of the objects that got shot down last weekend.
I take that to mean you guys don't have any plans to reimburse the bottle cap balloon brigade?
I don't know of any plans to reimburse. We honestly don't know what this is.
What do you make of that? So it seems like Joe Biden was embarrassed that this Chinese intelligence gathering dirigible was allowed to float over the whole of the continental United States, and then turned around and embarrassed the entire nation of the United States of America by shooting, well, some harmless balloons out of the air at a cost of about $450,000 each.
Yeah. Dagan, it looks like the president got a little bit trigger happy. We can all come up with potential motivations for that. Certainly, perhaps to change the narrative of weakness, he decided to shoot down something that they actually didn't think was a threat. It appears those objects were different. It appears that they hadn't identified them completely. It sounds like maybe one of them was belonging to someone here in the States. Look, I never want to be critical of a president who makes a decision based on good information to actually deliver good outcomes for the American people. But I haven't seen any indication that they thought that these particular objects were actually posing either the intelligence collection threat or what I'll call the geopolitical humiliation threat that the balloon that traversed our country for 5 days did. I'm chuckling because, 4 shoot downs in the course of a week or two is something we've not seen in the United States before. And so something was deeply, fundamentally different here. And it's unfortunate. I hope this pattern doesn't continue. I hope we're only shooting at things that we know what they are. And when they present real risk, we'll actually go after them.
That would be nice, Mr. Secretary. Let me switch gears to you. Let's talk about 2024. There's been some speculation you might jump in the race. I'm not going to ask you, though, not put you on the spot, because you're not going to answer me anyway, I'm sure.
I will. No, I'm just kidding.
President Trump's in the race. Nikki Haley's in the race. My question for you, though, is this going to be like a 2016? You're going to have 15, 20 candidates? Are we going to have a handful of candidates? How do you see this field developing? A lot of people getting in?
It's a fair question, and it's better than the one Dagan's thinking about asking. I think there'll be a whole handful of people come into the race, Sean. I hope so, frankly. I hope there's enough folks that we get a diversity of conservative ideas, that this is debated through Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina on arguments, not tweets. This is a moment. This is serious. We've just been talking about what's happening in East Palestine. We've been talking about what's happening from the Chinese Communist Party. This is a moment for serious American leadership, and I hope the debates, the discussions, and the arguments that however many candidates put forward are about those things.
Mr. Secretary, we got to go in a second, but do you think there'll be a big difference in ideas? It seems like everyone's going to run on the America First platform. Do you see a real debate on ideas? Is there some difference between the candidates, do you think, that's going to develop?
Yeah, I think there'll be pretty sharp differences. You're right. I think the work that we did for 4 years, putting America first, was pretty effective, and I think vast majorities of the American people actually believe that, frankly, across a pretty broad political spectrum. But there's sharp differences, right? There's too much money being spent by both political parties. Yeah, we've got to tackle some very difficult issues about how we're going to defend our nation, and the threat from the Chinese Communist Party is real, as is the one from big tech companies. We've got to make sure that, and it will take a deep set of debates about how to approach those so that we can serve the American people well.
I wasn't winking at you. I had one eye closed. When are you deciding, if you haven't already?
Haven't decided yet, Dagan. Next couple months, Susan and me, my wife, will make our decision, and you'll know, because you'll see the change in where we spend our time. We'll be in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina all the time if we go that route.
We can't wait for Susan to make that decision.
It's always better be a we.
Sean, you know the story well, my friend.
Mike Pompeo, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.